News studies, headlines, social media posts, podcasts, short videos. Now, some of it's very valuable, some of it's misunderstood, and some of it is simply wrong. Dr. Lee, how do you decide if new health information is credible? I'm going to actually share with you the questions that I ask when I evaluate new health information that I see or hear. So, when I hear about a new health finding, a recommendation, one of the things that I do is start with, "Hi, I'm Dr. William Lee, physician, scientist, and author of the books Eat to Beat Disease and Eat to Beat Your Diet. Books on how the body defends itself against disease and how your body can heal itself. Today, there's an enormous amount of health information online. News studies, headlines, social media posts, podcasts, short videos. Now, some of it's very valuable, some of it's misunderstood, and some of it is simply wrong. One question I get asked a lot is, Dr. Lee, how do you decide if new health information is credible? So, in this video, I'm going to actually share with you the questions that I ask when I evaluate new health information that I see or hear. By the end, you're going to know the same framework that I use as a physician and scientist when I look at health information and try to figure out, is it credible or not? Now, before getting into that, let me briefly explain where my perspective comes from. I'm a researcher, and as somebody who's been involved with scientific discovery over many, many years, I've learned a lot of things. For example, I've worked on research showing how cancer can be starved by cutting off their blood supply. I've worked on research on how to heal wounds that don't heal by speeding up blood vessel growth. I've done research that helps explain how coronavirus causes disease in COVID, and I've been involved with cancer vaccine work that can help the immune system fight cancer and even reverse it. Now look, discoveries like these take years of work and very, very detailed experimental design and analysis, really a lot of critical thinking. And it's really because of that experience that I tend to look at new health information very, very carefully. So when I hear about a new health finding, a recommendation, whether it's online, in the media, or even from my colleagues, one of the things that I do is start with some basic questions that I ask. So here's how I evaluate new health information. First, I ask, is there research behind the finding or the recommendation? I want to know if the information is coming from a study from the lab or in the clinic. Is there an actual study at all, or is it somebody's interpretation or opinion, personal experience, or are they just sort of repeating an urban legend? Sometimes the research being discussed is brand new and smoking hot. That's the kind of work that I do. I'm used to that kind of research. But sometimes it's really just really old research that's just been reinterpreted and resurfaced, right? But the starting point is whether the information actually comes from a real scientific study. That's number one. Number two, I ask, where was the research done? Was it done at a university? Was it done in a hospital, a medical center, a research institute, or even a company? Real research has identifiable investigators. These are researchers. Oftentimes they're academic researchers from a university. Sometimes they're corporate researchers. Sometimes they're government researcher. I always look for that because if I can't find out who's doing the study and where it was done, if the information is vague, like for example, when they say scientists say, it becomes a lot harder for me to evaluate where this research is coming from. So I look for specific details that can help trace where the study is coming from and where the data is coming from. Number three, the third question I ask is, does the health information or recommendation, does it make biological sense? Now, I always look for biological plausibility. That means is something that affects one thing biologically plausible, that it affects something else and leads to something else, right? There's got to be a mechanism. It might involve the immune system. It might involve metabolism or blood vessels. I study angiogenesis. So I'm really good at connecting the vascular connections between health findings or health recommendation. What about hormones? Does it deal with a hormone? Is it the microbiome or maybe another biological pathway? If there's no clear explanation for how something works in a body, it becomes much harder for me to interpret that finding. And sometimes I'll simply put the information aside until I can find more evidence. Sometimes the latest discoveries are kind of difficult to decipher, and that's okay. But I sort of just don't take it lock, stock, and barrel and just kind of go with it. I really need to understand the mechanism. Number four, I ask if the research has been peer review viewed. Now, peer review is something that every single scientist and clinician understands. It's part of the process. New findings are written up and submitted to peers. These are other experts before they can be presented at a conference or published in a journal. All right? Sometimes they get reviewed before it goes into a press release. But the key thing is that peer review gives other expert eyes a chance to take a look at the data of the study and ask good questions about it. Now listen, I serve as a peer reviewer myself, and so I know what that's about. Part of that role is asking the hard questions to make sure the research is rigorous, well designed, the data makes sense, and the conclusions that are being made are supported by the data. It's kind of a no holds barred way to get at solid science. Most scientists have been involved with peer review. Now look, peer review isn't perfect, but it is actually an important credibility filter. And if something hasn't been peer reviewed yet, it doesn't mean that it's not worth talking about or that it's wrong. It may be just that the research is still early and evolving, which is okay, but maybe that means it's not ready for prime time yet. Number 5, what I ask, what kind of study is being discussed? Some research is done in cells in the lab, some are done in animals in the lab, some are done in humans. Now, animal studies are extremely useful for understanding biology and mechanisms. All right, we've made a lot of discoveries in animals. I've done it myself, but the results don't always directly translate to people. That's important to know. And I can tell you as a cancer researcher, what every cancer researcher knows is that we have cured cancer in animals and mice time and time again. But it's not that easy to translate those results over to humans. In fact, most of the time, the same approaches that work successfully in mice, for example, in the lab don't translate exactly to human cancer patients. So look, the biology can be clear, but the translation to people might have a long way to go. So we got to be cautious about that. That's how I think about this. Now, also knowing the kind of study helps put the findings into a context. I mentioned lab studies. This is really where a lot of research is done in a laboratory under controlled DS conditions. You know, people in white coats, working in cells, wearing goggles, or handling animals. Very, very important foundation for research. A lot of discoveries are made. Another kind of study is a clinical study. And this is really requiring physicians, investigators to enroll patients. And now we're talking about real people in a clinical study. Sometimes the clinical studies are small, sometimes they're large. And then the question is, are they large enough to conduct a randomized clinical trial? You've heard about clinical trials. These are often used to look at medical devices or pharmaceuticals. They're really designed to test an intervention against a placebo. We don't really use a sugar pill these days, but that's kind of traditionally how it was thought. The intervention versus not intervention, quote, the sugar pill, and let's see which one has a desired effect. All right, of course, this clinical study could also be a population study. Population studies are just like what they sound like. Large groups of people in the real population, letting them not necessarily be in controlled circumstances, letting them live their lives, collect the data, and then sit back looking at all the data. Try to analyze statistically to see what the patterns actually are. Each type of research is important in its own sense, but they answer different types of questions. I ask this because based on a type of study, I would come to a different type of conclusion on what the study shows and how relevant is it to people. At this point, I really want to make an important statement about scientific evidence because you often hear we need evidence. Evidence is important. Evidence-based medicine. But listen, I'm somebody who has actually spoken about, lectured, and tried to help educate my peers about evidence-based practice of medicine. And one of the things I know is that you'll often hear that, and I'm going to put this in quotes, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trials are the gold standard. And sometimes you're made to think that if it's not an RCT, randomized control trial with a placebo, it's not really going to be a very rigorous study, and that the results might not be meaningful. Well, listen, RCTs, randomized control trials, are very, very powerful, and they let us answer specific types of questions about cause and effect, which is really great and very important for pharmaceutical trials, new drugs, for example, but they're not the only way to do research. And in fact, they're usually not the way to make important discoveries, because if you're trying to do research to discover something new, you really can't have a closed mind. Most randomized trials are kind of a closed mind, either this or that, and if it doesn't make it, then the whole thing is blown up. But discovery research, which is partly what I've been involved with, is keeping an open mind and exploring, investigating, observing, and then sort of seeing what actually comes out and making sense of it. All of this is important, and I will tell you that the most important advances in medicine, they actually all start as observations, seeing something that you might not have been expected. That's what a scientist notices and then investigates further. You've all heard about Darwin, who went to the Galapagos and came up with these ideas about evolution. Listen, he went out there with an open mind and saw that the birds, the finches on the different islands in the Galapagos, their beaks were shaped differently. He didn't go there preordaining that this is what he was going to find. He kept an open mind and collected and sketched and just kind of observed. So I'm just telling you something as important as evolution actually started as just an observation. So that's very important as well. And then there's statistics, right? You've probably heard about something called the p-value. P is in Peter value, all right? And it is a way for us to calculate whether there's a cause and effect, whether a treatment or an intervention is different from the placebo or no treatment, sometimes called a control. And if you run the statistics and you get a p-value that's less than 0.05, bingo, you're actually saying this is the study that's statistically significant. I'm right about the hypothesis, but I gotta tell you that only answers part of the question. You got to keep an open mind. P-values are not about right and wrong, good versus not good, correct versus not and not correct. They just tell you something about the statistics. You got to keep a bigger open mind than that. So I always use biological reasoning, and I try to understand the mechanisms, and I try to integrate what it is that I'm seeing and hearing and thinking about into a broader body of evidence. All right, when you're looking at research, you can't just look at one study. You really have to kind of look at a bunch of studies to understand what's the general direction that this research is going in. Does this one finding make sense compared to everything else? Right? So again, this is why interpreting research, it's really helpful if you have a research background, at least someone like me. I kind of know how to do it. And that's why I take it so seriously to look at other studies and critically analyze them before I translate them or talk about them to anyone else. I also ask a sixth question, and I ask who's interpreting this information, who's explaining the research. All right, the actual source of the research matter, but then who is interpreting it and telling it is a whole other important factor. Now, different communicators have different styles of education and they have different backgrounds as well. And because backgrounds might be different, they are bringing to the table different kinds of expertise. What do I mean by that? Well, look, a PhD scientist, all right, could have a really deep understanding of some part of biology or molecular mechanism. That's really great. But that individual might not have the same perspective or expertise that a physician has. A medical doctor whose work involves seeing real patients in real time and understanding all the complexities of clinical behavior, clinical medicine, and clinical outcomes. There's a lot of nuances to patient care that make a big difference. Now, what about another expert like a registered dietitian, for example? All right, I work with many colleagues that are credentialed in this area. Well, look, they actually know a lot more about nutrition than many PhDs or medical doctors, and they have practical expertise in recommending and monitoring guiding actual nutrition. That's a very valuable skill set and experience to have. On the other hand, a nutrition scientist who's studying the elements of food may know a lot more about metabolism or biochemical pathways. So, people who are working in the same area, even in the same area, may actually have different levels of expertise. And to me, all the perspectives are really, really valuable, but they address different aspects of science and health. It does help to consider what is the background of the person communicating that information, because they're naturally going to have their own comfort level and maybe even bias in terms of what they're telling you, but also how they're telling it to you. I can say that researchers in general, like me, we tend to speak more carefully about research findings, and we tend not to jump to, far-flung conclusions, basically, because we know things are a lot more complex than they seem, and there's a lot of things that we need to take into account before we can generalize anything. Number 7, the seventh question that I ask when I'm looking at new health information is what is or is there any bias? Now, what do I mean by bias? I mean, listen, somebody might have an interest in that information telling you that information. For example, if someone is selling a product that's connected to the topic that you're hearing about, that's a kind of bias, right? And bias is something to keep in mind when you hear anybody talking about a product. And then finally, I'll tell you what I do when I'm looking at new information. I personally cross-check. What do I mean by that? Well, I will look at the original study if I can, and then I will go research what other scientists in the field are also saying. How do you do this? You look for other papers on the same topic. You look for editorial or commentaries on a research paper. You look at how other people are thinking about it, maybe even a different point of view, or maybe even arguing that there's a different way to analyze the results altogether. I actually think it's really valuable, especially when it comes to new research, to see if there are different interpretations of the same finding. It doesn't mean one person's right, one person's wrong, but it means that there's different ways of actually interpreting the data. And that's really valuable, especially for new discoveries. Like when you hear people talking about nutrition research, some of the stuff seems like this is like brand newly discovered. But actually, it's probably based on some long-standing research. There might be a new piece to it, and there may be more than one way to actually analyze what they're trying what the findings that you are telling us. So when I cross-check, it helps me verify what I'm seeing, what I'm hearing about, and it does give me different ways to think about the conclusions, right? It's my advantage to be able to walk around conclusion and say, well, maybe it's this way, but wait a minute, maybe there's a different way to think about it. All right. And then what I can do is place the information in a broader context, which is really the fair way of looking at. I want to make up my own mind if something is true or relevant or actionable for people to do for their own health. So, having said all this, putting it all together, I just wanted to say this is my approach to assessing new health information when there's a sea of information coming out all the time. Number one, I ask, where does the research come from? Number two, I ask, does it make biological sense? Number three, I ask what type of study was done. And number four, who's interpreting the research anyway? And number five, are there other perspectives, other points of view on the finding? And running through these questions helps me decide how much weight I give to the way that somebody is telling me about the new information. And before I draw any conclusions myself, right? We don't take things automatically for granted. We really want to be able to think about things and decide what we actually believe on it. And I forgot to say, it's important to keep an open mind. I always, as a researcher, know it's better for me in looking at any type of science or research. Keep an open mind because you know something that you might not think even intuitively is correct. What if it is? This is actually how scientific discoveries are made, and take it from me. I've actually made a number of scientific discoveries you got to be snorts open-minded about. So if this way of thinking about health information is helpful to you, then I invite you to subscribe my channel because I share videos like this regularly, and now you know a little bit about the process I go through before I actually share that information. Having said that, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Hey, if you like that video, then you're going to love this one. Check it out.